Welcome to Sonara's Deep Dive.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that extracts the most important insights from complex topics, giving you the shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Today, we're tackling a subject that is, let's just say it's incredibly complex.
It really is. We are undertaking a deep dive into a practice that is simultaneously permitted by divine law, deeply embedded in some very powerful cultural norms, and, well, intensely debated by modern science. We're talking about consanguineous marriage.
It's arguably one of the most sensitive topics we could cover because you're dealing with this profound paradox that touches on health, on lineage, politics, and, of course, faith.
And it's not a niche practice.
Yeah.
Across vast swaths of the globe, specifically we're talking about the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, marrying a close biological relative, most commonly a first cousin, remains incredibly common.
Right, and that's the core tension we need to unpack. Here's the paradox.
Go on.
The practice is widely, almost universally permissible under Islamic law. There's a clear legal foundation for it.
Yeah.
But when you apply the metrics of modern medicine, of demography, of sociology to this pattern, you uncover some really profound public health crises and even structural pressures on the societies involved.
So our mission today is to rigorously analyze the material. We're going to start with the source of that permission, the theology. Then we'll trace the cultural reasons for why it's so persistent. And finally, we have to confront the hard scientific and economic consequences that result.
And just to set the stage, we should probably define our terms really clearly.
Good idea.
When we say consanguineous marriage, or CM, we're referring to marriages between second cousins or closer. So spouses who share common grandparents or even great-grandparents.
And the geographical reality here is just, it's undeniable.
It is. The highest global rates are overwhelmingly concentrated in Muslim-majority regions.
And when you say high rates, we're not talking about a few percentage points. These aren't marginal statistics.
Not at all.
Yeah.
We're talking about regions where over 20% of all marriages are consanguineous. And in many places, it spikes to 40, even 50% or more in specific populations.
Wow. Can you give us an example?
Sure. In Pakistan, first cousin marriages frequently fall somewhere between 38 and 49%. And in Saudi Arabia, you consistently see high overall rates.
So this is a practice that's deeply woven into the social and political fabric of these places. It's not just some marginal custom.
Exactly. And to understand why that is, we can't start with the consequences. You can't start with the genetics.
You have to start with the source.
You have to begin with the source material that allows it to exist in the first place.
Yeah.
The theological and legal foundation.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When we examine the foundational texts of Islam, the Qur'an and the Sunnah, we find that the legal principle governing CM is not one of religious encouragement.
That's a critical distinction.
Right. There are no clear mandates saying you should marry your cousin. It's more a principle of explicit legal permissibility.
Mubut, that's the technical term. It's simply one of many options available to a believer. It's not commanded, but it's not forbidden either.
So to understand what's allowed, you first have to know what's forbidden.
That's the key to Islamic jurisprudence, yes. To find out what's permissible, you establish the boundaries of what is explicitly prohibited. And the central text that details the women who are forbidden for marriage, the women known as Amorim, is found in the Qur'an.
Where specifically?
In Surah An-Nisa, that's chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. And this passage is incredibly detailed.
So what does it specifically forbid? What's on that list?
It gives an exhaustive list of prohibitions. It says, forbidden to you for marriage are your mothers, your daughters, your sisters, your paternal aunts, your maternal aunts.
Okay, so all the immediate female relatives.
Exactly. It goes on. Your brother's daughters, your sister's daughters, your foster mothers who nursed you, your foster sisters, your wives' mothers. It's a very careful outline of which kinship ties are permanently, completely off limits.
And here is where the legal space for cousin marriage just swings wide open.
Right, because cousins, that is, the daughters of your paternal uncles and aunts and the daughters of your maternal uncles and aunts, are conspicuously absent from that list.
They're just not there.
They're not on the list. And that exclusion is, for all intents and purposes, the legal and theological confirmation of their permissibility.
If you're not on the prohibited list, you're by default a potential spouse.
Correct. The following verse, verse 24, even summarizes this principle. It says, lawful to you are all beyond those mentioned, so that you may seek them with your wealth in honest wedlock. It's a clear, unambiguous statement.
So you have this permissibility by omission, but then that idea is solidified by the most powerful source of practical legal precedent there is.
The life and practice of the Prophet Muhammad himself, the Sunnah.
Absolutely. What's the key example here?
Well, the foundational historical example, the one everyone points to, is the marriage of the Prophet Muhammad's own daughter, Fāṭimah, to his first cousin, Ali ibn Abī Ṭālib.
A union right at the very heart of the early Muslim community.
Exactly. It provides an undeniable practical demonstration that the practice was seen as legally and socially sound from the very beginning. It's a powerful precedent.
And there's more in the Qur'an itself that touches on this, isn't there? A specific verse addressed to the Prophet.
Yes, there is. In Surah Al-Ahzab, chapter 33, verse 50, there's a unique provision that was addressed solely to the Prophet himself.
What did it say?
It explicitly allowed him to marry the daughters of his paternal and maternal uncles and aunts, his cousins, if they had emigrated with him and wished to marry him.
Now, you said that was specific to him, so how does that apply to the rest of the Muslim community?
Well, while the allowance itself was specific, its inclusion in the Qur'an serves a crucial secondary purpose for legal interpretation. It confirms, beyond any doubt, that cousins are not inherently malacham.
I see, because if they were forbidden in the same way a sister or a mother is, a special allowance wouldn't even make sense.
It would be a contradiction.
Yeah.
So it reinforces the idea that cousin marriage falls completely outside the scope of permanent, absolute prohibition.
So with these clear scriptural signals and this powerful prophetic precedent, what was the outcome? What was the consensus across the various schools of Islamic law?
The consensus, or ijma, has been, frankly, unwavering. Among all major schools of both Sunni and Shiite jurisprudence, the conclusion has remained constant for over 1,000 years. Marrying one's first cousin is legally permissible.
An unbroken legal chain.
A very strong, unbroken legal consensus. And what that did was provide this massive flexibility. Essentially delegated the final decision to, individual circumstances, societal pressures, and the cultural norms of a given community.
So the law said you may.
But it never, ever said you must.
That's a really interesting point. I want to dig into this sort of the classical rationale. Before we had modern genetics, did the early jurists have any framework for thinking about this? Why prohibit a sister but permit a cousin? Was there a health consideration at all?
That's a fascinating legal question. And it forces us to look at the law as a kind of a functional mechanism.
Right.
And our sources, including some contemporary analysis of classical texts, suggest that yes, they did. Classical Sharia prohibited marriage between first-degree relatives, permanently so, parents, siblings, children, because the transmission of, let's call them hereditary traits from such close unions was considered high. It was immediately observable.
They could see the negative outcomes.
They could see it. They recognized that risk. So those prohibitions really did serve as a kind of primitive but actually quite effective health safeguard for those first-degree relatives.
Okay, so that was their line in the sand.
Precisely. But then when they looked at relatives like first cousins, the argument, as you find it articulated in some of these classical opinions, was that the risk of those hereditary traits being passed down was perceived as, well, as minimal.
Minimal compared to a brother-sister union, for instance.
Exactly. They were trying to strike a balance. They wanted to avoid the major social and biological disruptions they saw from first-degree unions, while still allowing the perceived social benefits of second-degree unions.
Benefits.
Stability, lineage protection, keeping property in the family, all the things we'll get to. The point is, they miscalculated the long-term cumulative genetic risk.
Of course. They didn't have the science.
They didn't. But the legal framework they built made perfect sense based on the knowledge that was available to them in the 7th and 8th centuries.
So to sum up this whole section then, the permissive legal structure was established based on a classical risk assessment that ended up prioritizing social stability. And that, in turn, created the necessary legal and theological space for the practice to become culturally entrenched.
That is the core conclusion. The permissibility in the law created the space for a practice that would later become dominant, not because of religion, but because of some very powerful non-religious socioeconomic and political pressures.
Which is exactly where we need to go next.
Yeah.
Okay, so if the law merely permits cousin marriage, that doesn't explain why the rates would skyrocket to 40 or even 50% in so many regions.
No, it doesn't.
Clearly, there are some incredibly powerful forces sustaining this practice that go far beyond just religious duty or permission. So let's start with the most immediate, the familial level, social and economic stability.
Right. And if you look at this practice from a purely transactional sort of economic perspective, especially in pre-modern or even traditional societies today, it makes perfect sense.
How so?
The core cultural motivation is financial and structural. It's about asset retention.
Keeping wealth, land, resources, all of it
Right.
inside the immediate family lineage.
Exactly. Marriage becomes an economic mechanism. It's a way to prevent the fragmentation of wealth. Think about it. If a daughter marries an outsider, someone from a rival clan, or even just a distant family, her inheritance goes with her.
It leaves the family unit.
Yes, so this kind of marriage functions as a protective economic firewall. Keeps everything consolidated.
And beyond the purely financial, it also offers a pretty strong guarantee of social compatibility, doesn't it?
A huge guarantee. We see this in surveys done even today among university students in places like Saudi Arabia.
What do they say?
They confirm this perspective. Parents actively promote CM because they perceive it as inherently more stable.
Well, I'm more stable.
Because of that guaranteed compatibility. The spouses often grew up together. They share the same social context, the same expectations. They already know all the family politics before the marriage even takes place.
There are fewer surprises.
Far fewer. There's this sense of continuity and a belief that there's a reduced risk of divorce or major conflict that marrying a complete outsider might introduce.
Okay, so these motivations are powerful, but they feel very localized to the family unit. We need to zoom out now to the societal level. Some of our sources argue that kinship in the Middle East and North Africa isn't just a preference.
It's a fundamental structural feature.
Yes, one that permeates the political systems, the judicial systems, the entire state.
This is a crucial transition in our analysis because it moves us from the dynamics of the family to the fragility of the state itself.
And to understand that, we have to introduce a pretty famous concept from classical political theory.
We have to. We need to talk about the 14th century North African scholar Ibn Khaldun and his concept of asabiyya.
Asabiyya. For those who haven't heard of it, it's this idea of group solidarity or social cohesion.
Right.
The glue that binds a group and drives its political power.
Right. Khaldun argued that the most intense, the most powerful asabiyya exists in tribal or nomadic groups that are bound by blood ties. This intense kinship loyalty allowed them to muster greater force, greater unity.
Which enabled them to overthrow weaker, more settled urban societies.
Exactly. And establish their own ruling dynasties. Now, the modern scholarly critique ties consanguinity directly to this concept. It's seen as the fuel for this asabiyya.
How does cousin marriage, and I know the sources point specifically to father's brother's daughter marriage, FBD, how does that fuel this intense loyalty?
It creates an intensely focused, inward-looking unit. Your ultimate loyalty isn't to an abstract concept like the nation-state or a flag or some impersonal bureaucracy.
Your loyalty is to your immediate kin.
It's to your brother's son, your cousins. The clan becomes the primary source of everything.
Oh.
Protection, resource distribution, even justice.
And the political consequence of that, according to this critique, is that this persistence of intense kinship structures prevents the societal transition that, say, happened in the West.
Precisely. It prevents the shift from what sociologists call Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft.
Can you break those terms down for us?
Sure. Gemeinschaft is basically community. It's based on personal, emotional kinship ties. It's the village, the clan.
Okay. And Gesellschaft?
That's society. It's based on impersonal, rational, legal, and bureaucratic ties, the nation-state.
I think I have an analogy. Let me try this out.
Go for it.
Gemeinschaft is like a close-knit, family-run business where everyone is related and loyalty is based on blood.
Okay, yeah.
And Gesellschaft is like a modern multinational corporation where loyalty is based on a contract, on merit, and on adherence to a set of abstract rules.
That is an excellent analogy. That's a perfect way to put it. And these modern scholars argue that when that kinship loyalty, that Gemeinschaft, remains paramount, the state apparatus itself never truly becomes a Gesellschaft.
So the state isn't seen as public property, serving all citizens equally?
No. It remains, as some of these critiques dramatically put it, the private loot of the ruling clan.
And this structural weakness, this idea of the state as private property, that would explain the fragility and the political instability we see in so many countries that lack that deep institutional strength.
You're talking about places like Iraq, Libya, Yemen.
Right, where in the absence of a strongman dictator, the whole system just defaults back to tribal warfare.
The default is always to the strongest asabiyya. And this intense aristocratic politicking, as one source calls it, which is based on lineage and marriage. It's visible even when states try to implement democratic institutions. Pakistan is a perfect example of this.
Okay, let's use Pakistan as a detailed case study then. How does this political kinship operate among the elite there, moving beyond the theory and into, tangible power structures?
In Pakistan, The elite political groups, we're talking about the big landlords, the industrialists, the dynastic political families, they strategically leverage both descent and marriage to constantly regenerate these bonds of loyalty.
It's a tool for survival.
It's a mechanism for resource distribution and political survival. A study of this aristocratic politicking found that these kinship systems form the essential frameworks of attachment. They ensure the political power is reproduced dynastically generation after generation.
And it's not just about sharing a family name.
Oh no, it's about controlling provincial power bases. It's about ensuring favorable outcomes in the judicial system, coordinating political campaigns, all through these unbreakable family networks.
So political marriage reinforces political power, which makes it incredibly difficult for any outsiders, any non-dynastic figures, to break through the system.
That's the structural challenge. But we have to be fair here and look at a compelling counterargument that's presented in some of the literature on Pakistan.
Okay.
It really pushes back against the idea that kinship is solely the cause of the state's problems.
Interesting. What does this alternative critique suggest?
It suggests that the reliance on these kinship networks by the political elites is actually a logical workaround.
A workaround for what?
For a state that is fundamentally weak, a state that lacks resources, and a state that's unable to provide stable institutional governance, or reliable judicial review, or universal public services.
Wow. Okay, that shifts the perspective dramatically. So the elite aren't relying on kinship just to be oppressive or to hoard power.
They're relying on it because the alternative, relying on the state, is completely unreliable.
If the bureaucracy won't deliver justice and the police won't provide security,
you revert to the most trusted, most reliable institution you have, your kin network. So in this view, kinship is filling a vacuum that was left by weak state institutions. It's not necessarily the primary cause of the weakness itself.
And you mentioned this argument stands in stark contrast to the more common narrative.
It does. It stands in sharp contrast to those who would blame the army and the ruling classes entirely for the state's failures. It's a more nuanced take.
But whether kinship is the cause or the coping mechanism, it's clear that it thrives because the legal environment supports a certain kind of control over marriage.
A patriarchal control.
Right. And this brings us back to the role of classical Muslim family law and the issue of agency, especially for women.
This is critical. Marriage, as it's codified under the classical Muslim family law that still persists in many of these regions, is viewed as a transaction. It's an agreement, a contract, but it's an inherently hierarchical one.
How so?
The groom consents, and that's straightforward. But the bride's consent is often seen as secondary, or in some cases even irrelevant to the core legal contract.
So whose consent is the deciding factor?
The operative consent belongs to her male guardian, her wali.
Let's elaborate on that mechanism because it seems absolutely crucial for understanding why cousin marriage persists so strongly. Under the traditional schools of jurisprudence, how much agency does a young woman actually have?
Well, in the three dominant Sunni schools of law, that's Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, the wali has sole authority, especially if the woman is a virgin.
Even if she's an adult?
Even if she is an adult, sane woman, her consent is not considered necessary for the marriage to be legally binding. The guardian's consent is the one that matters.
What about the fourth school, the Hanafi school? I've heard it's a bit more liberal on this.
It is, slightly. The Hanafi school does allow a woman to contract her own marriage. But, and this is a huge but,
There's always a but.
that right is immediately undermined by the wali's power to step in and seek dissolution of the marriage if it's deemed to be lacking in equality or suitability. This is the concept of kafa.
Kafa. The idea of suitability or equality that's often used to veto matches the family doesn't approve of. How does the wali leverage that power to push for cousin marriage?
Well, kafa is defined not just by religious piety, which is what you might think. It's often defined by lineage, by wealth, by profession.
Social status.
Social status, exactly. So if a woman tries to marry an outsider who's deemed socially inferior by her family standards of kafa, the wali can go to a court and have the marriage nullified.
So that power essentially forces her to choose a partner who is suitable by her father's standards.
Which conveniently often means a relative. A cousin is always considered kufu or suitable.
So the whole legal system centered on this paternal control and the ability to dictate kafa, it reinforces a culture where the father can ensure his daughter, and what some sources call her marriage value, remains concentrated within the extended family.
Within the bridal pool, as anthropologists call it. The consequence is that the legal system favors the old over the young and men over women. It fundamentally prioritizes maintaining the existing kinship structures over individual choice.
And cousin marriage becomes a direct outcome of that system.
It's a direct outcome of a system built on parental control, treating the daughter, in effect, as a valuable exchange asset to ensure the concentration of resources and loyalty.
Okay, so we have established the legal foundation of permissibility and then the powerful cultural, economic, and political drivers for persistence. Now, we have to transition to the third pillar of this deep dive, the scientific realities.
The consequences.
Right. Once these marriages are contracted, what does modern genetics reveal about the biological consequences for the offspring?
And this is where we move from the realm of social structures to the structures of DNA. This is where that theological permissibility crashes head-on into the bioethical imperative to minimize harm.
So let's detail the genetics clearly for everyone listening. First cousins share common grandparents. What percentage of their genetic material is, on average, the same?
First cousins share, on average, 12.5% of their genetic material.
1/8.
1/8, yes. And for geneticists, this means the coefficient of inbreeding for the child of a first cousin union is 0.0625. In simple terms, it means they're about 6.25% homozygous, meaning they have identical copies of genes from both parents at all locations in their genome.
Why does this shared percentage matter so much, especially when we're talking about disease?
Because it dramatically, and I mean dramatically, raises the probability that both partners are silent carriers of the exact same rare, harmful genetic mutation.
Explain that. What's a silent carrier?
Most people, you and I included, carry somewhere between 5 and 10 potentially harmful recessive mutations in our DNA. But because they're recessive, they don't cause any disease unless you inherit 2 copies of that same mutation.
One from each parent.
Right. And because these mutations are rare in the general population, the chances of marrying a random person who happens to carry the exact same rare mutation as you are, incredibly low. Marriage outside the family ensures that those mutations almost never get paired up.
But when cousins marry?
The risk of pairing up that same mutation, getting what geneticists call a double dose, is significantly amplified.
And this risk focuses specifically on what are called autosomal recessive disorders. Can you give us a few examples of those?
Sure. Autosomal recessive disorders are conditions that require inheriting 2 copies of the defective gene. Classic examples include sickle cell disease, or SCD, thalassemia, cystic fibrosis, and a whole range of metabolic disorders.
So in the general population, what's the baseline risk for a child inheriting any kind of genetic disorder?
The baseline risk is around 3%. That's the figure for the general population.
And what does that risk jump to when first cousins have a child?
The risk is quantifiable, and it is severe. Children born to first cousin couples face a 4 to 6% risk of having one of these autosomal recessive genetic disorders.
So that's a clear doubling, sometimes even tripling, of the baseline risk.
A doubling, yes. And when you think about that risk applied across millions of births, the cumulative effect of those cases is what overwhelms public health systems.
So what are the specific health issues that we see documented in these highly consanguineous regions? What does it look like on the ground?
Well, the morbidity, the rate of disease, increases across the board. CM significantly raises the incidence of congenital anomalies. That's the medical term for birth defects.
Okay.
You also see various neurological and physical impairments, developmental delays, and certain localized issues that become very common, like hereditary deafness, which is often caused by these recessive genes.
And I imagine we see this reflected in the regional public health data when you compare these regions to, say, Europe or North America.
Absolutely. The disparity is stark. Data shows that the birth defect rate in most Arab countries, for example, exceeds 69.9 per 1,000 live births.
69.9, and what's the comparison point?
Contrast that with rates in Europe, North America, and Australia. They typically sit below 52.1 per 1,000 live births. The risk of birth defects in children from first cousin marriages is consistently estimated to be somewhere between 1.7 to 2.8 times higher than in the general population.
Does this genetic burden also lead to higher mortality rates? Do more children die?
It does, yes. The data shows that children born to first cousins face a 4.4% higher rate of pre-reproductive mortality.
A 4.4% excess mortality rate.
Yes. Now, some initial smaller studies in prevalence areas sometimes showed a later relative mortality impact, but this was often attributed to studying very specific, isolated populations. The broad consensus from more robust research, especially studies out of Saudi Arabia and Sudan, indicates significantly higher postnatal mortality rates in children of consanguineous parents. and it's directly attributable to the increased frequency of these harmful recessive genes being expressed.
Now, there is a technical scientific debate that I think we should touch on briefly. It's the idea of genetic purging. The theory goes that since these populations have practiced CM for centuries, shouldn't evolution have purged or eliminated the most harmful genes over time?
That is the hypothesis, yes. That consistent inbreeding over many, many generations should reveal and then eliminate the most lethal recessive genes from the population, which would, in theory, lower the long-term genetic burden.
But is that what the data shows?
No. Extensive genetic studies on populations in the Greater Middle East show no evidence for a reduced burden of deleterious variation due to this purging effect.
So the purging isn't working as theorized?
Essentially, no. It seems that the rate of new mutations appearing in the gene pool keeps pace with any purging that might be happening, which maintains the overall high-risk profile of the population.
Okay, this intense, sustained genetic burden has led some academics to advance a highly controversial argument, one that links CM not just to physical health, but to more complex societal and political outcomes.
And we need to be extremely careful here.
Absolutely. We need to analyze this claim impartially, stressing to you, the listener, that we are reporting on an external academic argument that is present in our source material. We are not endorsing it.
That caution is paramount. This is a very provocative scholarly argument, which suggests that these sustained patterns of endogamy generate structural challenges and internal pressures that go beyond physical illness. The claim is that they potentially affect population-wide capabilities.
So what is the specific, and I'll say it again, highly sensitive claim being made here about the connection between genetics and behavior?
The source material presents the argument that children of consanguineous marriages have a statistically higher likelihood of diminished cognitive capacity when compared to the general non-consanguineous population.
Okay, and the argument doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't. The claim then extends this alleged biological outcome to a kind of socio-political susceptibility.
Can you walk us through that extension? How does that leap get made?
The source argues that this diminished cognitive capacity, when compounded across very large populations over many generations, may correlate with certain behavioral issues.
Such as?
Such as increased aggression, a susceptibility to cognitive inflexibility, which means rigid black and white thinking, and an increased vulnerability to extremist manipulation.
So the argument, just to be crystal clear, is that if critical reasoning and impulse control are impaired on a population level,
then the ability to resist simplistic, aggressive, or extremist narratives collapses. And the source posits that this could be a contributing factor to societal issues like extremism and terrorism.
that is a remarkable and, frankly, explosive leap, connecting a potential biological outcome directly to a political one. We are including this in our analysis as a highly contentious academic claim that represents the most extreme interpretation of the long-term genetic burden.
Indeed. And setting aside that deeply complex and, highly disputed claim, the more tangible, the more measurable impact of this genetic burden is undeniably economic.
The financial cost is staggering. The sources describe it as a massive drag on the economy, particularly in resource-rich states like the Gulf Cooperation Council nations.
Let's put some numbers to that. In Saudi Arabia, the total societal cost, and that includes treatment, hospitalization, lost productivity, family care burdens, all of it, for just Breck and Paradover. Sickle cell disease alone is estimated at $1.4 billion annually.
1.4 billion for one disease.
For one disease. Thalassemia, another common recessive disorder, costs an additional $393 million a year. So when you start to factor in the cost for the entire spectrum of congenital anomalies, you're talking about tens of billions of rials being diverted from the public health budget.
That's the cost in a wealthy rentier state that can, to some extent, absorb that expense through oil revenues. What is the impact in lower income but highly populous countries like Pakistan?
In low-income countries, the impact is catastrophic, but at the family level. The lifelong treatment for a condition like thalassemia major requires constant expensive blood transfusions, chelation therapy, specialist care.
Things the state often can't provide.
Exactly. The state can't subsidize that carefully, so the burden just devastates family finances. It consumes their savings, it forces them to sell assets like land, and it creates this debilitating cycle of intergenerational poverty that is almost impossible to escape.
There is also an argument made in the sources that this health burden affects the indigenous labor force in wealthier states, which then forces them to rely on foreign workers.
Yes, that's a structural argument. It posits that the reliance of the Gulf states on these massive expatriate labor forces is, in part, attributed to a domestic workforce that faces persistent health and capability challenges because of a high burden of consanguinity.
So the rentier-state model, which relies on oil revenues rather than domestic production.
It effectively masks this underlying structural weakness in the indigenous labor pool. But it raises some very serious long-term questions about national human capital and sustainability.
The scale of this public health crisis is just. It's undeniable, whether you look at it through morbidity statistics or these staggering economic costs. So governments in the region have been forced to act. What has been their primary policy response?
The dominant response, really the main strategy, has been the introduction of mandatory premarital screening and genetic counseling programs, PMSGC for short.
Okay, so countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Jordan, they've all implemented this.
They have. They've recognized that they have to confront these morbidity rates head on.
But how do they reconcile this kind of scientific intervention with the theological permissibility of the marriage itself? That seems like a tricky line to walk.
It is, but they justify these programs by appealing to the higher principles of Islamic law, specifically the principle of maslahah, which means public interest.
Maslahah.
Yes. It's a well-established principle that allows for legal rulings that safeguard the general welfare of the ummah, or the community. And this is directly supported by a foundational hadith, a saying of the Prophet, no harm and no reciprocating harm. La darar wa la dirar.
So the screening programs are framed not as a challenge to the law, but as an application of it.
Exactly. The goal of PMSGC is seen as a means of achieving this mandated public interest, protecting the unborn, and minimizing severe avoidable harm. For example, the Saudi program mandates testing for the major regionally prevalent conditions like sickle cell disease and thalassemia before you can get a marriage license.
So on the surface, this looks like a perfect convergence. Science informs the choice, and Islamic law mandates minimizing harm.
It should be.
But we run into what the sources call the policy paradox. These programs have been largely unsuccessful in achieving their primary goal.
Their primary goal being high rates of marriage cancellation.
Right.
And that is the core frustration for public health officials. Despite the mandatory testing and counseling, most PMSGC programs fail to meet their target, often a 65% cancellation goal among couples who are identified as high-risk carriers.
So they get the information that their child has a high risk of a serious disease, and they get married anyway.
In many cases, yes. The medical data is often overridden by those deeply ingrained cultural and economic commitments that we talked about earlier.
Why are those social pressures so powerful that they can defeat a clear medical warning like that?
There are a few reasons. First, you have the intense pressure of family stability and kinship loyalty. Calling off a promised cousin marriage can bring immense shame and disruption to the two families.
Right.
Second, there's a common reliance on a kind of religious fatalism, the concept of tawakkul. It's a trust in God, but it can sometimes manifest as a belief that the outcome, good or bad, is ultimately determined by divine will, not by genetics.
It's in God's hands.
Precisely. And finally, you have the transactional nature of the marriage contract. The decision often remains with the wali, the guardian, who might be prioritizing keeping the family wealth consolidated over the potential health of his future grandchild.
Okay, so if couples still go ahead and marry, how on earth have these programs managed to successfully reduce the prevalence of affected births? The sources say by reporting rates of at least 65% in places like Iran, Turkey, and Iraq. That seems like a contradiction.
It does, but the success lies in the second half of the equation. It's about prenatal detection and subsequent therapeutic intervention options.
Meaning screening during the pregnancy.
Exactly. Since the couples choose to marry despite the risk, the programs pivot their strategy. They provide screening during pregnancy, which then leads to the highly sensitive but critical issue of therapeutic abortion for severe fetal anomalies.
This brings us right back to the theological nuance. Is therapeutic abortion acceptable in Islamic law? And how do scholars justify it under the Sharia?
The answer is yes, but under very specific medically necessary conditions. And this legal allowance is absolutely fundamental to the success of these genetic screening programs.
So how do they justify it?
Islamic scholars utilize the principle of minimizing harm and preserving human dignity, or karamah.
And what are the defining boundaries for this? I assume there are strict rules. What do the majority fatwa, the religious rulings from major Sunni and Shiite authorities say?
The broad consensus permits therapeutic abortion before the time of ensoulment.
Ensoulment, the point at which the fetus is believed to receive its soul.
Right. And the majority opinion among jurists places this point at 120 days after fertilization, which is approximately 19 weeks of gestation.
So termination is permitted before 120 days if two conditions are met.
Correct. The first condition is that there are serious fetal anomalies or severe incurable disabilities. The second is that multiple physicians, often a panel of 3 is required, must agree on the diagnosis.
The reliance on medical consensus is interesting.
It's key. It shows the integration of modern science, what they call ACL or intellect, into the legal ruling framework. And it's also important to note termination is permitted at any gestational age if the mother's life is at direct risk.
So this legal framework shows a commitment to using medical science alongside Sharia principles to achieve that higher goal of minimizing harm.
That's the rationale, yes.
But despite the success in prevention, the fundamental legal conflict remains. This brings us to the theological deadlock that prevents an outright ban on CM itself.
Exactly. The most conservative religious establishments, particularly in the Gulf, fiercely resist any top-down, state-mandated ban on cousin marriage.
What's their argument?
Their argument is clear, simple, and from their perspective, unassailable. Surah An-Nisa, verse 24, explicitly permitted this practice. Therefore, the state cannot legislate to forbid what God has permitted.
So to pass a law banning it would be seen as a political act that directly undermines the divine text.
It's perceived as the state claiming that modern science knows better than the Creator, which is an unacceptable, almost blasphemous position for these conservative bodies to take. And that deadlock is what prevents the kind of legislative ban we've seen in other countries, like China, for example, which instituted outright prohibitions.
So governments are forced to rely on counseling and screening instead of outright prohibition?
That's their only politically and theologically viable path.
But regardless of the official legal stalemate, are attitudes changing on the ground? Is education, is access to information having an effect?
They are. And this is probably the most powerful and hopeful sign of organic change. We see it in data from Saudi university students, for instance.
What does that data show?
It shows a significant and growing trend toward discouraging CM. And positive attitudes against consanguinity are strongly associated with several key demographic factors.
Let me guess. Education is one of them.
It's the biggest one. Higher education, especially for students enrolled in health sciences programs, is a huge predictor. The others are female gender women are more likely to be against it, and higher parental income.
So education and prosperity act as powerful social solvents against the practice.
It's a very powerful solvent, yes. The data is consistent across the region. CM rates remain consistently higher in rural areas and among the poorest and least educated segments of society.
And what about female education specifically?
Studies in places like Jordan and Yemen show a strong inverse relationship. The higher a woman's educational level, the lower the likelihood she will marry a first cousin. As educational levels increase, and especially as women gain more agency and autonomy over their own lives, which are the very factors undermined by the classical ʿAlī consent regime, the prevalence of the practice just naturally declines.
So this bottom-up social shift.
It may be far more effective in the long run than any top-down legislation could ever be.
This has been an incredibly rigorous analysis. We've spanned theology, political anthropology, genetics. It's a lot to take in. We started with the clear, undeniable permissibility that's established in the Qur'an and the Sunnah.
Which created that initial legal and social space for cousin marriage to exist.
Right. And then we traced the practice's persistence through these deeply ingrained cultural and political mechanisms, things like asset retention, clan loyalty, and the political dominance that's fueled by asabiya.
And we saw how the classical ʿAlī system, the system of male guardianship, reinforces that patriarchal control over marriage decisions.
And finally, we had to confront the hard scientific realities, the genetic burden, the economic cost, which has forced modern states to intervene with these massive public health programs.
And what this whole analysis really illuminates is the fundamental tension that exists in these societies. It's a balancing act.
A balancing act between what?
Between the deep stability and tradition that's inherent in these kinship structures on one side, and the ethical and public health imperative to minimize harm and safeguard future generations on the other.
And the current solution seems to rely not on banning the practice, because that's blocked by the theological deadlock we discussed,
but on leveraging modern medical science and integrating it with an evolving religious interpretation. The allowance for therapeutic abortion, For severe anomalies, which utilizes principles like karamah, dignity, and maslah, public interest, has proven to be the single most effective strategy for mitigating the resulting genetic crisis.
It really highlights that the most powerful force for change might just be the irresistible accumulation of knowledge.
I think so. The theological deadlock itself is rooted in that fear that modern science knows better than the Creator. Yet the application of Islamic legal principles like maslahah is meant precisely to guide humanity in applying divine law in changing times to ensure the well-being of the community. It's a built-in mechanism for adaptation.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to carry forward from our deep dive today. We've seen that educational attainment and increased female agency are already organically driving consanguineous marriage rates down. Considering that necessity is often the mother of theological reinterpretation, what will be the ultimate tipping point that finally resolves this paradox?
Will it be the slow, irreversible accumulation of undeniable medical and economic data that proves the cultural cost is simply too high for society to bear?
Or will that necessity eventually force the conservative religious establishment to redefine the very boundaries of permissibility, using the principle of maslahah to justify a change? We leave you with that question about how knowledge and critical thinking continue to challenge even the most entrenched social practices.
It's a fascinating convergence of the divine, the demographic, and the scientific. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
We'll catch you next time for the next deep dive.
Thanks for tuning into Sonara's Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future episodes. I bring you fresh content every week. Thanks for listening.